Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now let's begin this one. Master Sergeant Brett Vasquez had built his life on two pillars: duty to his country and devotion to his wife. After 15 years of marriage and 4 brutal tours in Afghanistan, he thought he'd earned a right to come home to something pure. Instead, he discovered that the woman he'd fought to protect had been systematically destroying everything he held sacred. Brett had married Rita Durham when they were both 22, fresh out of college and drunk on love. Rita was a kindergarten teacher then, with gentle hands and a laugh that could heal wounds he didn't even know he had. She'd supported his decision to join the military, kissed him goodbye at every deployment, and welcomed him home with tears of joy. But war changes people, and Brett had returned from his 4th tour a different man. Harder, more calculating. He noticed things now. The way Rita's phone was always face down, how she startled when he entered rooms unexpectedly, the credit card statements showing expenses he didn't recognize. The discovery came 3 weeks after his return. Brett had been unpacking his gear in the garage when he found Rita's spare phone hidden behind paint cans. The messages painted a picture that made his blood run cold. Not just adultery, something far worse. For months, while he'd been dodging IEDs and watching brothers die, Rita had been conducting an affair with Colin Pugh, Brett's former best friend and fellow soldier who'd been medically discharged after losing his left arm to shrapnel. But the affair was just the beginning. The messages revealed a calculated plan to destroy Brett's life, steal his military benefits, and frame him for domestic violence to secure a hefty divorce settlement. Colin had been feeding Rita information about Brett's missions, his psychological evaluations, even his private conversations with military counselors. Together, they'd been building a case to paint Brett as an unstable veteran prone to violence. Rita had already filed preliminary reports with local police about concerning behavior and had photographs of self-inflicted bruises ready to submit as evidence. The most damning discovery was their plan for the children. Rita had indeed given birth to twins 8 months ago, but not Brett's children. The twins belonged to Colin, conceived during Brett's deployment. Their scheme involved claiming Brett as the father, securing massive child support payments, and then disappearing together once the divorce was finalized. Brett spent 3 days reading every message, memorizing every detail, and planning his response. His military training had taught him patience, precision, and the art of strategic warfare. Rita and Colin had declared war on him. They just didn't know he'd already won. Brett's transformation into a cold, calculating predator began immediately. For 2 weeks, he played the role of the loving, slightly traumatized husband returning from war. He attended couples therapy sessions Rita had helpfully arranged, where he carefully displayed just enough emotional instability to support her narrative, while secretly recording everything. During this time, Brett was building his own network. His military connections ran deep, and he began reaching out to specific contacts, not just fellow soldiers, but intelligence officers, military police investigators, and personnel from the Judge Advocate General's Corps. He framed his inquiries as routine security clearance updates and family verification procedures. The key to Brett's plan lay in Colin Pugh's discharge circumstances. While Colin claimed he'd lost his arm heroically, Brett discovered the truth. Colin had been selling military intelligence to foreign contacts and had lost his arm while attempting to destroy evidence during a raid. The military had covered up the incident to avoid an international scandal, but Colin's discharge papers contained coded language that marked him as a compromised asset under ongoing investigation. Brett also discovered that Rita had been using her position at the elementary school to gather information about military families, particularly those with deployed spouses. She'd been part of a larger network providing personal information to divorce attorneys who specialized in military cases, helping them target vulnerable servicemen for maximum financial damage. The twins, meanwhile, were living proof of Colin's ongoing deception. DNA evidence would not only prove Brett wasn't the father, but would also establish Colin's paternity, and Colin was supposed to be sterile according to his medical discharge records. The children's existence would expose his false medical claims and reopen his entire military file. Brett began setting traps. He started documenting Rita's absences with hidden cameras, but more importantly, he began feeding her false information about his military records, his deployment income, and his psychological state. Rita eagerly passed all of this to Colin and their attorney, creating a paper trail of their conspiracy. The masterstroke came when Brett accidentally left documents suggesting he'd received a substantial combat bonus and was suffering from severe PTSD. Rita immediately filed for emergency child support, claiming she feared for her safety and needed to protect their children. She requested $10,000 monthly in support, citing Brett's substantial military income and his dangerous mental state. The day before the hearing, Brett received a call that would change everything. His contact at Military Intelligence, Major Rachel Aguilar, had completed her investigation into Colin Pugh's network. What she discovered exceeded even Brett's suspicions. Colin wasn't just selling information to divorce attorneys. He was part of a broader operation targeting military families for financial fraud and identity theft. Rita's school had been the perfect cover, providing access to families of deployed soldiers who were vulnerable and isolated. The network had stolen millions in military benefits and had been sharing intelligence about troop movements and family structures with hostile foreign agents. The twins' birth certificates had been falsified using Brett's stolen military ID. Rita and Colin had planned to use the children as anchor points for their fraud, claiming benefits for Brett's children while disappearing with the money. Worse still, they've been preparing to sell information about Brett's Special Operations Unit, including details about ongoing missions that could get his teammates killed. Major Aguilar explained that military jurisdiction applied due to the national security implications. Any civilian court proceeding could be suspended immediately if military intelligence determined that classified information or military personnel were at risk. All Brett needed to do was present the right document at the right moment. Brett spent the night before the hearing in meditation and preparation. He'd learned patience in the mountains of Afghanistan, watching enemy positions for days before striking. This was no different. Rita and Colin had made their move. Now it was his turn. He arrived at the courthouse dressed in his formal military uniform, every ribbon and medal precisely placed. Rita's attorney had advised her to portray Brett as unstable and dangerous, so his polished, professional appearance would immediately undermine their narrative. Rita sat at the plaintiff's table with their attorney, Jesus Rowe, a sleazy divorce specialist known for bleeding military men dry. Colin sat in the gallery, wearing a cheap suit and displaying his prosthetic arm prominently for sympathy. They brought the twins as props, two innocent babies being used as weapons in their war against Brett. The judge, Honorable Matthew Jameson, was a veteran himself, a detail Brett's research had uncovered. Judge Jameson had served in Vietnam and had little patience for anyone who dishonored military service. As Rita's attorney presented their case, painting Brett as an unfit father and dangerous veteran, Brett sat silently. He watched Rita perform her role as the terrified wife, watched Colin nod sympathetically from the gallery, watched their attorney pile lie upon lie into the court record. When Judge Jameson asked if Brett had anything to add, the courtroom fell silent. This was the moment Brett had been preparing for, not just for 3 weeks, but for his entire military career. Every mission, every decision, every moment of discipline had led to this. Brett stood slowly, removed a single document from his briefcase, and walked to the judge's bench. As he handed over the paper, he spoke his first words of the hearing. "Your Honor, I believe this changes everything." Judge Jameson's face went through a series of transformations as he read the document. First confusion, then surprise, then a dawning comprehension that made his jaw tighten with barely controlled rage. The paper Brett had handed him was a classified military intelligence brief marked with the highest security clearances, identifying Colin Pugh as a compromised asset under active investigation for espionage and Rita Durham as a co-conspirator in a network targeting military families. "Marshal," Judge Jameson's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Lock down this courtroom immediately. No one enters or leaves without military authorization." The change in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. Rita's lawyer, Jesus Rowe watched his papers scatter as his hands began to shake. Rita herself went pale, her eyes darting between Brett and the exits as armed federal marshals moved into position. Colin Pugh attempted to rise from his seat, but a marshal's firm hand on his shoulder kept him in place. Furthermore, Judge Jameson continued, his voice gaining authority, "I'm suspending these proceedings pending a military investigation. Mr. Vasquez, I understand you have additional evidence to present." Brett nodded slowly, his expression never changing from the cold mask he'd worn throughout the hearing. "Your Honor, the children Mrs. Durham claims are mine were born to Colin Pugh while he was under investigation for selling military secrets. DNA evidence will confirm that neither child is biologically mine, and their birth certificates were fraudulently filed using my stolen military identification." The revelation hit the courtroom like a bomb. Rita's carefully constructed facade crumbled as she realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. She thought she was dealing with a broken soldier, suffering from PTSD. Instead, she'd walked into a trap laid by a man who'd spent years hunting enemies in the most dangerous places on Earth. "Mrs. Durham," Judge Jameson's voice was ice cold. "Are you represented by counsel in any ongoing federal investigations?" Rita's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Jesus Rowe tried to object, but Judge Jameson cut him off with a gesture. "Mr. Rowe, I advise you to contact a criminal defense attorney immediately. Your client appears to have been operating under false pretenses in my courtroom." As military police entered the courtroom, Brett finally allowed himself a small smile. The document he'd presented contained not just evidence of Colin and Rita's crimes, but detailed intelligence about their entire network. Major Aguilar had been thorough. Every message, every meeting, every fraudulent transaction had been documented and traced. Colin Pugh wasn't just facing charges for the original intelligence breach that had cost him his arm. He was now implicated in ongoing espionage, identity theft, fraud against military families, and conspiracy to endanger active military operations. Rita faced similar charges, plus additional counts of child endangerment for using the twins in her scheme. But Brett's revenge was just beginning. As federal agents escorted Rita and Colin from the courtroom in restraints, Brett remained seated, watching with the same calm intensity he'd used to observe enemy positions through sniper scopes. The twins, now in the custody of Child Protective Services, would undergo DNA testing that would formally establish what Brett already knew: they belonged to Colin, not him. Judge Jameson requested a private conference with Brett and the lead federal investigator, Agent Lena Weston. In chambers, Agent Weston laid out the full scope of the investigation that Brett's intelligence had triggered. "Mr. Vasquez," Agent Weston began, "your wife and Mr. Pugh were part of a network that targeted over 200 military families across 14 states. They've stolen an estimated $12 million in benefits, and the intelligence they provided to foreign contact has compromised multiple ongoing operations." Brett absorbed this information without emotion. "What's the timeline for prosecution?" "Federal charges will be filed within 48 hours. The military tribunal for Mr. Pugh's original charges will reconvene once we've documented the full extent of his treason. Your wife faces federal conspiracy charges, identity theft, fraud, and potentially accessory to espionage." Judge Jameson leaned forward. "Mr. Vasquez, I need to ask, how long have you known about this conspiracy?" 3 weeks, Brett replied. "I discovered Mrs. Durham's secondary phone the day I decided to end our marriage. Everything since then has been intelligence gathering and trap setting." Agent Weston whistled low. "You've been feeding them false information?" "Every piece of data they used to build their case came from me. The income figures, the psychological evaluations, even the bank statements, all carefully constructed fiction designed to make them overreach." Brett's voice remained steady. "I needed them to commit to their scheme publicly before I destroyed them." The agent and judge exchanged glances. They were dealing with a man who'd turned domestic betrayal into a military precision operation. "What's your next move?" Judge Jameson asked. Brett stood, straightening his uniform. "I'm going to ensure they understand the full consequences of their choices." Rita destroyed 15 years of marriage for money. Colin betrayed his country and endangered my unit for profit. Neither transgression can be forgiven or forgotten. As Brett left the courthouse, he activated a secure phone and made a call to Major Aguilar. Phase 1 complete. Initiate Phase 2. The Major's voice was grim with satisfaction. Copy that. We've identified 17 other military families they've targeted. The Financial Crimes Division is already moving to freeze their accounts and recover stolen funds. But Brett's personal vendetta was far from over. Rita and Colin had attacked his identity, his service, and his honor. They'd used innocent children as weapons and endangered his brothers-in-arms for money. In Brett's world, such betrayals demanded complete and utter annihilation. As he drove away from the courthouse, Brett began making calls to very specific contacts, men who understood that some debts could only be paid in full. 3 days after the courthouse confrontation, Brett sat in a secure conference room at Fort Bragg, watching his federal agents dismantle the network that had destroyed dozens of military families. The scope of the conspiracy exceeded even his worst assumptions. Special Agent Joe Russell led the briefing, her voice clinical as she outlined the investigation's findings. Colin Pugh's network operated for 3 years, targeting military spouses during deployments when they were most vulnerable and isolated. They used legitimate businesses as fronts: Rita's elementary school, a chain of military family support centers, even several veterans assistance nonprofits. Brett studied the conspiracy map on the wall, connecting Colin and Rita to dozens of other participants. Each line represented a family destroyed, a serviceman betrayed, a fortune stolen. The financial damage alone exceeds $15 million, Agent Russell continued. But the intelligence breach is catastrophic. Pugh sold troop movement schedules, family security details, and operational parameters to 3 separate foreign intelligence services. Major Aguilar added grimly, 2 missions were compromised directly due to intelligence Pugh provided. We lost good soldiers because of his greed. Brett's expression never changed, but his hands slowly clenched into fists. Colin hadn't just betrayed him personally. He betrayed every soldier who'd ever served beside him. What's the prosecution timeline? Brett asked. Federal trial begins in 6 months, Agent Russell replied. Military tribunal for Pugh starts in 3 weeks. Rita Durham faces 47 federal charges. If convicted on all counts, she's looking at life in federal prison. Brett nodded slowly. And their associates? 17 arrests so far, with more coming. We've recovered approximately $8 million in stolen funds, though much of it was already transferred overseas. Agent Russell paused. Mr. Vasquez, there's something else. Your wife attempted to negotiate a plea agreement yesterday. Brett's cold smile was answer enough. She's offering to testify against the entire network in exchange for reduced charges. She claims she was manipulated by Pugh and didn't understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Rita Durham is many things, Brett said quietly, but she's not stupid. Every message, every plan, every scheme was her idea. Colin provided the military intelligence. Rita provided the execution and the targets. Major Aguilar consulted her files. Speaking of which, we've discovered she was using her position at the elementary school to identify military children and gather intelligence about their families' deployment schedules. She had access to emergency contact information, family financial data, and detailed personal histories. The revelation added another layer to Brett's understanding of his wife's betrayal. Rita hadn't just cheated on him. She'd weaponized their entire community, turning a place where military children should feel safe into a hunting ground for predators. Agent Russell closed her folder. Mr. Vasquez, we need to discuss your role in the upcoming trials. Your intelligence gathering was instrumental, but you'll need to testify about how you discovered and documented their activities. Brett stood, straightening his uniform. I'll testify to the facts, Agent Russell, but I want something in return. What's that? When this is over, when they're all in federal prison, I want 5 minutes alone with Colin Pugh. Just 5 minutes. The room fell silent. Agent Russell and Major Aguilar exchanged glances, understanding the weight of Brett's request. That's not something we can officially arrange, Major Aguilar said carefully. Brett's smile was sharp as a knife. I'm not asking for official arrangements. 6 months later, Brett sat in the federal courthouse witness stand, his uniform impeccable, his voice steady as he systematically destroyed Rita's defense. Over 3 days of testimony, he methodically presented evidence that painted his wife not as a victim of manipulation, but as the criminal mastermind of a conspiracy that had devastated military families across the country. Rita sat at the defense table, looking smaller and more haggard than Brett had ever seen her. Her attorney, a federal public defender named Mario Whitman, had tried desperately to portray her as Colin's victim, but Brett's testimony made that impossible. Mr. Vasquez, Whitman asked during cross-examination, isn't it true that you gathered evidence against my client through illegal surveillance? Brett's response was measured and precise. I discovered Mrs. Durham's secondary phone while cleaning our garage. As her husband, I had legal access to our shared living space. Everything I found after that initial discovery was documented through proper federal channels. But you admit to deceiving your wife about your income and psychological state? I provided false information to test whether Mrs. Durham was sharing private family details with unauthorized parties. Her actions confirmed she was compromising military operational security. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Kelsey Gleason, had built an airtight case. Rita's phone records, financial transactions, and recorded conversations with Colin painted a picture of calculated greed and deliberate treason. The evidence Brett had gathered during his 3 weeks of investigation formed the foundation of charges that would put Rita away for life. During a recess, Brett encountered Rita in the courthouse hallway. For a moment, they stood facing each other, the woman he'd once loved and the stranger she'd revealed herself to be. Brett, Rita whispered, tears streaming down her face. Please, I know I made mistakes, but we had 15 years together. That has to count for something. Brett studied her face, searching for any trace of the woman he'd married. He found nothing but desperation and manipulation, even now. 15 years, he repeated softly. 15 years I spent fighting for our country while you turned our home into a base of operations against military families. 15 years I thought I was protecting something worth fighting for. Rita's hands reached toward him. I can explain. No. Brett's voice was final. You can't explain selling intelligence that got soldiers killed. You can't explain using children as weapons in your fraud. You can't explain betraying every military family who trusted you. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear. I forgave your affairs, Rita. I understood that war changes people, that loneliness makes people do desperate things. But you didn't just cheat on me. You betrayed our entire community for money. That's unforgivable. Rita's face crumpled. What about mercy? What about second chances? Brett's smile was cold as winter. I learned something in Afghanistan, Rita. Some betrayals are so complete, so calculated, so destructive that mercy becomes complicity. You chose your path when you decided to destroy military families for profit. Now you get to live with the consequences. As he walked away, Brett felt something he hadn't experienced since his return from deployment. Peace. The war was almost over. The verdicts came down like hammer blows. Rita Durham, guilty on all 47 federal charges, sentenced to life in federal prison without possibility of parole. Colin Pugh, guilty of espionage, conspiracy, fraud, and treason, sentenced to death by military tribunal. Their 17 associates received sentences ranging from 20 years to life. Brett watched from the gallery as Rita was led away in shackles, her life effectively over at 37 years old. She'd traded 15 years of marriage and a stable future for 3 years of crime that netted her less than $2 million. The mathematics of her destruction were brutal in their simplicity. But Brett's revenge was not yet complete. 2 weeks after Rita's sentencing, Brett received a call from an old friend in military intelligence. Package is ready for delivery, the voice said simply. That evening, Brett drove to a warehouse outside Fayetteville, North Carolina. Inside, he found Colin Pugh secured to a chair, conscious but unable to move. Two military contractors stood guard, men who'd lost friends due to Colin's intelligence leaks. "Hello, Colin," Brett said, removing his jacket and rolling up his sleeves. "I promised you we'd have a conversation about consequences." Colin's eyes were wild with fear, but his mouth was taped shut. Brett pulled up a chair and sat facing his former friend. "You cost me 15 years of marriage," Brett began conversationally. "You cost my unit 3 good soldiers. You cost military families across the country their homes, their security, their trust." He leaned forward. "But most importantly, you made me into something I never wanted to be. You turned me into a man who has to hurt people to protect what's left of his honor." Brett stood and walked to a table of tools the contractors had prepared. "I learned some interesting techniques in Afghanistan, Colin. Ways to cause maximum pain without causing death. Ways to make betrayal feel like the mistake it was." Over the next 4 hours, Brett methodically extracted payment for every betrayal, every lie, every dead soldier Colin's greed had created. When he was finished, Colin Pugh understood the true cost of his choices in ways that prison never could have taught him. "The military tribunal will execute you in 6 months, Brett said as he cleaned his hands. "But tonight, you learned what justice really means." Colin Pugh was found dead in his cell 3 days later, an apparent suicide. The official investigation concluded that guilt over his crimes had driven him to take his own life. Only Brett and 2 contractors knew the truth, that Colin had died because some betrayals demanded blood payment. 1 year after the courthouse confrontation, Brett stood in his rebuilt home office, looking at the wall where he'd once displayed photos of his marriage. Those pictures were gone now, replaced by commendations from military families whose stolen benefits had been recovered, letters from soldiers whose lives had been saved when the intelligence leak stopped, and a certificate acknowledging his role in exposing the largest military fraud conspiracy in American history. The twins, Colin's children, had been adopted by a military family in Texas who could provide the stable home they deserved. Brett had ensured they would never know the truth about their biological parents' crimes. Children shouldn't pay for their parents' sins. Rita's fate had been sealed months ago. Federal prison had not been kind to a woman who betrayed military families. Word had spread through the system that she'd sold intelligence that killed soldiers. Prison justice operated by different rules than civilian courts, and Rita had learned those rules the hard way. She would serve every day of her life sentence, assuming she lived long enough to see it completed. Brett's phone rang, interrupting his reflection. Major Aguilar's voice was crisp with business. "Brett, we've got a new situation. Intelligence suggests there's another network operating out of Camp Pendleton, targeting Marine families. We need someone with your particular skill set to investigate." Brett smiled, feeling purpose return to his life. "What's the timeline?" "Deployment in 2 weeks. This is off-books, civilian contractor status. You'll have full authority to investigate and document their activities." "What about termination authority?" Major Aguilar's pause spoke volumes. "Whatever the situation requires, Brett. Some betrayals can't be solved through conventional justice." Brett hung up and began packing his gear. He'd found his new calling, hunting those who preyed on military families, who turned service and sacrifice into opportunities for profit and betrayal. It was work that suited his particular talents and his absolute refusal to forgive those who betrayed their country and their communities. As he loaded his truck, Brett reflected on the lessons of the past year. Rita and Colin had taught him that mercy was weakness when dealing with calculated evil. They'd shown him that some people were so fundamentally corrupt that rehabilitation was impossible. Most importantly, they'd proven that sometimes justice required going beyond what the law could provide. Brett Vasquez had returned from his 4th tour a different man than he'd left. He'd discovered that the real war wasn't in Afghanistan. It was here at home, against those who betrayed the very values soldiers died to protect. It was a war he intended to win, one betrayer at a time. The foundation of his new life was built on a simple principle. Loyalty deserved protection. Betrayal demanded destruction. It was a code he could live with, fight for, and, if necessary, die defending. As he drove toward his next mission, Brett smiled grimly. He'd learned to stop believing in second chances and start believing in final justice. It was a lesson Rita and Colin had paid their lives to teach him, and it was a lesson he intended to pass on to every enemy he encountered. Some men were broken by betrayal. Others were forged into something harder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. Brett Vasquez had chosen to become the latter.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.